what we're going to do in this chapter is talk more about fiscal policy, which is something we learned about in Chapter 10. Remember, if the economy is in a recessionary gap, Keynes would recommend expansionary fiscal policy. So here's how that looks. So even though this is coming from Chapter 10, the material that we're doing, you're going to continue seeing in the future, so we're still going to be using these graphs. So here's our natural real GDP, and here's our aggregate demand, showing where our real GDP is, which is here, and our CPI. So hopefully your knowledge of this is well established at this point. And what Keynes would recommend is expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy refers to the expansion part of that refers to expanding the economy. So basically figuring out a way to make GDP go up. And Keynes recommends to cut taxes and or raise government spending. And the logic is that if the government increases spending or cuts taxes, people will have more disposable income. And if people have more disposable income, they'll spend more. So the government will get the ball rolling with an initial increase in government spending, for example. All right, so the government may spend $100 billion. And then we get the multiplier effects on top of that, leading to an increased aggregate demand and potentially an increased CPI as well. Okay, so that can fix any problems that we have in regards to recessionary gaps. But there is a problem with expansionary fiscal policy, and we're going to address these in this chapter. We may not get to all of those, certainly not in this video. I may string this over 2 days, so it'll take us a little time to get through all of these, but we're going to discuss all of these problems. So the problems with expansionary fiscal policy, there are 3 that I certainly want to talk about. One is governmental debt, which is what we're going to begin talking about in this chapter, or in this video. And then there's other things we need to discuss. Time lags, which is a pretty easy concept. And then something a little more challenging, something called crowding out. All right, so that's kind of where we're heading in this chapter. And we're going to discuss some tangentially related issues as we go through this chapter as well. So the first thing I want to discuss is governmental debt. So by definition, expansionary fiscal policy causes debt. So if the government cuts taxes, why does that cause debt? Well, if the government cuts taxes, that means government revenue decreases. Just like for individuals, if they bring in less revenue, if my income goes down and I don't change anything else, that could push me into debt. So if you cut taxes, government revenue decreases. Likewise, if we increase government spending, that raises expenses. So both of those activities are going to increase governmental debt. And in fact, our government is tremendously in debt. These actions that the government is taking are funded by government borrowing. So it's through expansionary fiscal policy that a government can get itself in some trouble because our government has been borrowing a lot of money to fund expansionary fiscal policy. Okay? So let's see how much debt we're in. Our debt is growing very quickly. And to see why debt gets created, we can just look at, for example, the 2018 federal budget. So remember, we're talking at the federal level, the national level. We're not talking about like the state of Georgia's government. We're talking U.S. government. Our federal budget has allocated spending of about $4.17 trillion, which is a tremendous amount of money. If our government was a country, it'd be one of the biggest countries in the world, just in terms of the government alone. And its revenues, comparatively, are much smaller at $3.34 trillion. I'll go ahead and say it. This is idiotic. This is idiotic because our economy is so strong right now. This is a silly time to be taking on so much debt. So the deficit that we have here is at about $833 billion. All right? And to be clear, when we talk deficit, we're saying what's happening in a year. Debt refers to how much we owe in total, okay? So the deficit means the government is spending $833 billion more than it brings in tax revenue. This is just in 2008. Okay, so when we talk deficit, we're talking this year. All right, when we talk deficits, we're talking over a current time period. Debt refers to how much the government owes in total. And in total, the government owes more than $20 trillion, which is it's a lot of money, right? More than $20 trillion. So we're saying more than that amount there, right? So this is millions, billions, trillions, more than $20 trillion, which means our government has the largest debt. In terms of total dollar value, the U.S. governmental debt is the highest. That's a bit misleading, though. It would make sense that our debt would be higher than other countries, partially just because we have also the highest GDP. So this is not a good thing, but it's maybe not as bad as it may initially meet your eye when you first learn about this. All right, so we have deficits in 2018, and we have a tremendous amount of debt. So before we throw Keynes under the bus, let's think about what he would suggest. Okay. Let's ask the question, what does our economy look like now? Okay? To answer that question, maybe the easiest thing to do is think about the unemployment rate. Because the unemployment rate tells us where our economy is in regards to the natural or real GDP. So our current unemployment rate, and you can look this up, is about 3.9%, which is really low, right? In fact, low enough that it might be a problem, low enough that we may start thinking about the potential of an inflationary gap. That's not the Keynesian way of thinking, okay? Let's think about this from Keynes's perspective. What does our economy look like? So there's our aggregate supply curve, showing our natural real GDP. And if our unemployment rate is this low, that has to mean that we have maxed out our production, okay? So remember, Keynes, he doesn't have any inflationary gaps because he basically believes an inflationary gap is not a problem. Inflationary gap means the economy is strong now, so he just basically ignores it, essentially. So what we do know is our aggregate demand must be very high. Okay? We know it must be very high because that's going to lead to the economy producing at full potential. Okay? So we're at our full potential. This is what we really care about. CPI is above where it could be. Really not a big deal. Okay, CPI, remember, we want some inflation, so it's not really an issue. This is what we care about down here, and our economy is very strong. So what would happen if we continue to do expansionary fiscal policy? And I'm going to write this in blue. If our economy is in this scenario here, what would expansionary fiscal policy do? Okay, so let's say the government increased spending even more, which it's doing this year, and let's say it cuts its revenues, where indeed revenues really haven't been rising in the U.S. in recent years. So what's that doing? What are these government policies doing? Well, they're boosting aggregate demand even further, which isn't accomplishing anything in regards to our real GDP. Prices get driven up a bit, but it's not doing anything to improve our GDP. So the bottom line is there's no benefit to this. This expansionary fiscal policy is meaningless. Okay? It's not generating any more real GDP, but beyond that, it's creating debt. All right? So no benefit. Real GDP is unchanged, but creates certainly a cost, which is more debt. So wow, this is the policies we seem to have right now federally are pretty poor in terms of thinking about the debt and our overall economy. And in fact, if right now, this is 2018, Donald Trump is our president. We could criticize him a lot about his economic policies, but frankly, if you look at most presidents, there's a lot of criticism economists have about their choices. It doesn't seem that they're following economic logic most of the time. It's more about doing things where you can tangibly see they're occurring, so you have something you can tell people is happening. So for example, if we do this, we do expansionary fiscal policy. For example, if the government starts building more roads, Donald Trump can come out and say, look, we're building stuff. We're making America great. But that's ignoring the fact that we're not getting any actual increase in real GDP as a result. So if we focus on the economics of the issues, it's pretty easy to be critical of most U.S. presidents. So Keynes would say, don't do this. This is really not accomplishing anything. So what should we do? Well, Keynes has a better solution. Okay? So let's think about where our economy is now after the government has been engaging in all of these periods of dramatic expansionary fiscal policy. What we've done is we've cooked our aggregate demand up to a really high level here. I'm going to leave our nice blue curve up here on the board. Okay, so there's our aggregate demand curve here. And here's our CPI. All right, so we've maximized our real GDP. And our CPI is really high, which again, that's not a big issue. The fact that CPI is high, a lot of students want to point at that and be like, oh, there's inflation. Inflation right now is a couple percent, right? We're not worried about inflation. That's not the big issue. The big issue is down here. This is what we care about. And the other big issue is our debt. Those are the things we really should be caring about here. All right, so expansionary fiscal policy, not a good idea. So what would Keynes recommend, given everything we know? Knowing that our unemployment rate is 3.9%, knowing that our government has a lot of debt, what would Keynes recommend? Well, what we could do is something called contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy. So this is like expansionary fiscal policy, but moving in the opposite direction. What we would do here is raise tax rates and lower government spending. Raise tax rates and lower government spending. Now, why the heck would we do that? Why would we ever want to engage in policies like this? Well, the answer is that you might need to cut back on governmental debt. Okay, the benefit here is we're going to cut back on governmental debt, or at least reduce the size of, reduce these deficits, right? That $833 billion deficit, maybe we could shrink that down, even if we're not cutting back on debt, or at least not building as much debt. And what would be the effects? If we think about our graph over here, if we raise tax rates, that's going to cut disposable income. If we lower government spending, that also would cut disposable income. And what happens when these things occur? People have lower disposable income and they spend less. So the effect is that aggregate demand gets driven down. Okay? The contractionary fiscal policy leads to a decreased aggregate demand, leading to lower CPI, okay? But most importantly, a fixed real GDP. We don't lose any of our real GDP. So according to Keynes, the benefit here is we could cut debt, and the cost of this action really is none, at least nothing substantial, okay? Now you might be tempted to look up here and say, well, is this causing some deflation? Yeah, maybe, but we haven't even gotten to the idea of the Federal Reserve and what they can do. The Federal Reserve has a pretty good job, has done a pretty good job of making sure this sort of thing doesn't happen. So they can reverse this, and it won't have the adverse consequences of deflation. So this is what Keynes would say to do. You raise taxes, lower government spending. This is contractionary fiscal policy. And since the economy is so good, you don't lose any real GDP. So overall, what Keynes recommends is something called counter-cyclical expansionary or fiscal policies. Counter-cyclical, okay? This means go the opposite direction of what the economy is trending towards. So if the economy is growing really fast or is really strong, do the contractionary policy. Try to tether it back in. The benefit of doing that is you can cut back on debt. If the economy is really weak, well then you do expansionary fiscal policy. So you kind of move against the economy, okay? So a very strong economy, expansionary policies is his suggestion. Very weak policy, go the other way. Alright, I'm sorry, said it backwards. A very strong economy, we need to do contractionary policies. Contractionary fiscal policies. And a very weak economy would call for expansionary fiscal policies. So what you would see is, when the economy is bad, it causes debt. But when the economy gets really good, we pay off some of that debt. Okay? In doing so, we end up with no substantial governmental debt because we essentially the government raises money when the economy is really good, and it spends it when the economy is really bad. In the U.S., we spend money when the economy is bad, and we spend money when the economy is good. We go into debt always. We always have a deficit. It's been a really long time now since we haven't had a deficit. In fact, you may not have been alive the last time we had a governmental surplus, meaning the last time the government brought in more money than it spent. I think the last time was 2000, so it's been a long time. Okay. So what we are left with in the U.S. is substantial debt. Which I want to talk a little bit about now. Just to give you a taste of where this is coming from, where it's being spent. A brief budget breakdown. Let me give you some terminology first. There are just a few ways the economy could be set up. You can have a budget surplus, which, as I mentioned before, hasn't happened in a really long time. A budget surplus means that spending is less than revenues. Okay, that would be like the government saving money. Okay, we can have a budget deficit, which means that spending is greater than revenues. And then we have a third option, which a lot of people have called for, balanced budget. And this is where spending would equal revenues. And I want to make sure we get back to this. This seems like a good idea, but it's actually not a good idea, and I want to show you why. Balanced budget is really not a very good idea. So these are three key terms just to know in terms of what our government could choose to do in terms of its budget. And what we do know is we've been in a deficit now for, 18 years, something like that. So let's think about spending and revenues. Let's think about where it comes from. Before we do that, let's think about revenues. Okay, we've got two sides of the coin, right? We've got the revenues and we've got the spending. So I want to discuss real quickly where these come from. What do you think the number one source of federal government revenues is? By far, it's not close. By far, it's income taxes. Income taxes, and I'm putting it in parentheses here, and similar taxes. So there's, personal income taxes, and then there's like corporate income taxes. I'm just lumping them all together. The income taxes make up about 93% of all federal revenues. So the reason why I want to make sure we point this out is because if we're thinking about the problems that we have in terms of our budget, income taxes is an interesting place to look because this is where most revenues come from. So if we want to increase tax revenues, we probably need to think about adjusting income taxes because the other sources simply have not been very lucrative. Changing income taxes in a way would be easy because it's just adjusting something we already do. Generating revenues from other sources is not going to be easy because we're not doing it much at all to begin with. So instituting brand new policies would probably be quite a strain on the economy. That being said, we do get revenues from other sources. So for example, tariffs. About 4% of governmental revenues come from tariffs. That may be changing as I speak because right now Donald Trump is president. He's pushing for a lot of tariffs. So this could go up. Economists, by the way, not a fan of tariffs. We'd probably just say let's just get rid of all of these. Here's an interesting one. Profit from the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve we haven't spoken much of at all in this class, but we're going to get to them on this test period. About 2% of sources, revenue sources come from that. And that leaves about 1% that come from various other sources. So for example, if you visit Yellowstone National Park, you might pay a fee to get into the park. That's a government revenue. Okay? So that's our top revenue sources. So if we're trying to adjust revenues, probably the easiest way to do that is through income taxes because that's where we're getting so much now. So you raise that up a bit in terms of the tax rates and you can generate more revenue potentially. Spending is another potential. Essentially, there's two ways to get rid of debt, right? Raise revenues or cut spending. So this is the other way to think about it. What if we could cut spending? Which is tough. Cutting spending is one of those things where most people say we should spend less, but it's hard for them to identify where. If you say, should we spend less, should the government spend less money, and you poll people, they'll almost always say yes. But if you start saying, well, should we cut this program or this program, this program? No. They don't want to cut any programs. They just want to spend less. It doesn't work that way. So we've had a hard time cutting spending because when politicians try to decrease spending, the public generally doesn't like the programs that they're cutting. They don't like the fact that we're losing governmental jobs, for example. So here are the top spending sources. And number one and number two are essentially tied. And if you look at a list online, you may see these switched. Social Security and things like Medicare and Medicaid. So these are funded governmental medical programs. Both of these, tremendous amount of spending here, about $1 trillion each. So here, between these two is the majority of spending. Okay, Social Security is money taken from people who are working now and essentially given to people who are retired. It's a form of spending because we could just take that money and do something else with it. And then Medicare and Medicaid, this is for people, generally lower income people, to get medical care. So this is, most of the spending comes from these sources. So if we want to cut spending, you probably would have to go here. Cutting Social Security is going to be tough because people now are counting on it in order to retire. And then cutting medical care, we know it's a big issue right now. That also is a very challenging thing because it's hard to tell people, we're not going to let you get treatment. Other sources, the military is number 3. Military spending varies greatly from year to year, and I'm looking at data from probably 2016, so it's third on the list. And then a fourth one here is interest on governmental debt. This is the scariest one. We owe, over $20 trillion, and that money is growing interest on it. So our fourth biggest spending is simply just to pay off the interest on the debt that we've already accrued. You probably understand this, but if you're in, for example, credit card debt, it's hard to get out because the debt is growing. So as you're paying it off, the debt is growing, and you've got to pay a whole lot to make it even just stop growing. Meaning, if you're in $100,000 in credit card debt, you're probably going to end up having to pay $15,000 a year just to keep your debt at $100,000, just to keep it from growing. Our government's in a similar scenario. We have so much debt that the interest on the debt is almost insurmountable, meaning just paying off the interest. If we could just keep our debt at the same level where it is now, that itself would be an incredibly difficult thing to actually achieve. So this is quite a challenge that we have. In terms of spending sources, there are way more than just these, but these are the 4 biggest ones. So if we're thinking about cutting the debt, we might want to think about trying to adjust some of these problems here. Unfortunately, things like interest on debt, nothing we can do about that one. Okay, so who do we owe? That's an interesting question to ask. Who does the federal government owe? And this will maybe make you feel a little bit better about our situation that we have. Okay, so let's call the debt $20 trillion. Truth be told, it's probably more than that. Depends on when you're watching this video. It's probably in 2018, maybe 21 trillion. If you're watching this in 2019, it may be up to 23 trillion because it's growing at a very fast rate. Let's call it 20 trillion just to make it a nice round number. The number one source of federal government debt is, if we think about just a very specific place where the money is owed. So who do we owe the most to? The government itself. This is a very strange thing, but about 5.6 trillion the government owes itself. How can the government owe itself money? This is strange, right? I mean, if I owed myself money, I would just ignore that, right? If I said, well, I owe myself $200, I'd just say, well, I'm just not going to think about that because it's meaningless. Because as soon as I pay myself back, that doesn't do anything, right? If I pay myself $200, that accomplishes nothing. So why does the government owe itself money? Well, the biggest source is, for example, Social Security. Runs on a surplus, meaning the Social Security actually has leftover money at the end of the year. The reason being that we're concerned that we have so many people that are about to retire because of the baby boomers and everything who are currently retiring or on the verge of retiring. We have so many people retiring that we may not have enough money for them. So over the past couple of decades, the government has set up Social Security to run on a surplus, meaning Social Security is building the funds that it has, with the logic being that we may need to dip into those funds and pay out these retirees in the future. So Social Security runs on the surplus, but the government, other agencies within the government, have been spending this money. So for example, I look at my paycheck and it says I, gave $1,000 to Social Security. Maybe 100 of that actually goes to the military. and the military tells Social Security, we'll pay you back. Okay? So Social Security is owed money by other agencies within the government. The logic here is the government would rather spend the money that it has than borrow more money and incur more interest on that money that it's borrowing. So this debt is real. It does exist, but probably we should actually ignore it. Okay? The reason we should probably ignore this, even though it kind of is dead in a weird way, is because if we just ignore this, if we just wipe it out, then we're really seeing what we owe. Okay? The government never has to pay this money back, right? If I'm in debt to myself, I never have to pay it back. But if I'm in debt to a credit card agency, I do have to worry about that. So that's kind of how our government is set up. This, in a way, is like a debt, but since we never have to pay it back, it's not a real liability. So what you'll see often occur with economists is we'll ignore that part of it, and instead we'll list something called the net public debt. The net public debt. This is money the government owes external. This is the money the government owes not to itself. Okay? And so the net public debt at the time of me writing this is about 14.6 trillion. Right? I just take the 20 trillion and deduct out the money that the government owes itself. And so that's more a better representation of our true debt, our debt that we actually owe to external sources. So it's about 14.6 trillion. So of that money, about 6 trillion is owed within the U.S. Okay? The government owes money, about $6 trillion within the U.S. Now, how does this happen? How does the government owe money in the U.S.? Well, the answer is anybody can loan money to the government. All right? I could do that right now. I could loan money to the government. And the reason I would do that is because I'm going to get interest in return. And the government's never not paid anyone back. So this can be a nice, safe way for me to save money. Okay? So how would I do that? Well, I could just walk down to the bank and say I'd like to buy some governmental bonds. And governmental bonds are essentially just IOUs. So I might buy a governmental bond where I give the government $1,000 today and the government pays me $1,200 in 3 years. The benefit is the government gets that money, they get to spend it now. And the benefit to me is I've got a nice, safe way to save my money. And in a couple of years, I'm going to earn interest on those funds. Lots of people do this. Lots of people take out governmental bonds. My wife, when she was a kid, people in her family would give her governmental bonds. So we have some at my house right now. If you have a retirement plan, there's a decent chance that part of what's in that plan is governmental bonds, because retirement plans are often dedicated to diversifying, right? Not just buying one thing. So one thing they may include in there, along with CDOs and stocks, is also governmental bonds. Businesses, a lot of times, will be stuck with a bunch of cash, and they don't want to just hold on to the cash because it's earning no interest. So they'll go out there and they'll buy some governmental bonds. The end result is the government owes a lot of people in the U.S. this money. This is real debt. This is real debt the government has to pay back. But it does have a kind of a strange benefit in that when the government pays this money back, it ends up being spent creating income. That income gets taxed, and then the tax revenues go back to the government. So in a way, when the government pays us back, it's going to end up getting a portion of it back in income tax revenue. Kind of strange to think about, but it's true. So about $6 trillion is owed within the U.S., okay? Roughly that same figure all right, and truth be told, I don't know which of these is higher. They're a real similar amount, but about $6 trillion is owed outside the U.S. And, it really doesn't matter if it's owed in the U.S. or internationally, truth be told, but about $6 trillion is owed internationally, if you're curious about that, with the top two sources being China and Japan. And I don't want to get into why it's China and Japan right now, but we may do that in a future episode. All right, so about $6 trillion is owed within the U.S. to private citizens, okay? about $6 trillion is owed internationally, and then there's a third category. This is in the U.S. too, but it's different. Okay, about $2.6 trillion is owed to the Federal Reserve. Remember, the Federal Reserve is the agency that prints money and helps determine interest rates and that sort of thing. So what the government has been doing is essentially it's been taking money from the Federal Reserve and using it in a very complicated way to spend. So basically the government's been borrowing printed money from the Federal Reserve. In reality, it's more complicated than that, but that's why that money is owed. So we could also say maybe the government doesn't ever pay this back. Maybe the government just says, Federal Reserve, we're not going to pay you back. Federal Reserve is a U.S. agency that could basically just wipe that off their books and it wouldn't be a problem. So once you narrow it down and you ignore the government's money that it owes itself, and maybe if you ignore this figure here, the debt starts feeling a bit more manageable in terms of what is truly owed. These are the funds. Number 1 and number 2 are the funds that the government just has to pay back, has no choice. But it might be able to get away with the other money that it owes and never pay that back. So that's a breakdown of the debt. And that seems like a good place to drop off with this video. If you have questions about the debt, there's various sources online that discuss it in greater detail. We could go into this in really great detail, but I'm not going to do that today. That may be something you cover in your upper level classes.